my name's Jean Seaton, and I'm going to chair this panel. And it seems to me the really interesting thing is that I haven't been to a great deal of the conference, but I don't think we should think that the arts or the public response or the popular response are something which are tacked on to the end of serious economic thinking. Because if you go back to the 1930s, Keynes wouldn't have happened, as it were, without the incredible fertility of ideas that were flowing around him. And again, I think that we're so familiar with the artistic response to the 1930s slump. It was one of the things that defined it, and it did in Britain. It produced great literature, George Orwell, J.B. Priestley. It produced some extraordinary art, and it actually produced some very interesting music and all sorts of, as it were, folky, going back to finding the people, exploring the people, things that really changed how people, and certainly some amazing cartoons that defined it as a moment of fiscal crisis that was insupportable. I mean, the art round it changed, I think, the apprehension of it. So what we've got today is to a very, very exciting and interesting panel to think about some of the responses to the current round of fiscal rectitude, which of course has consequences for everyday people. And we're going to start with Nicholas Hiley, who runs the wonderful, if you've not been there, go, cartoon archive in Kent, which has collected cartoons and made them into a different kind of thing. And I think it's always been a wonderful, wonderful thing. We've got Pam Cox, who may be familiar to you, but is also at the University of Essex, who's going to, building on her wonderful work on servants, which she's made programs about, is going to talk about the everyday response, the experience in people's everyday life. Then we're going to go to John Johnson, who's an art critic on The Guardian, to, I think, really, again, round up on what his much more expert eye than ours sees as the kind of response that's developing in the visual arts. And then we're going to go to Frank Gray and look at the way in which ordinary filmmaking and the way in which filmmaking has and has not responded, both of those, to the particular challenges that we're living through and where those things have come from. Of course, again, the 30s was the producer, wonderful Humphrey Carpenter. There was a whole movement that was both artistic but also recording, completely innovative, surrealism, banged together with reporting in an incredibly creative way. So where are the people doing it now? So we'll start, and then we'll have some talk. And I'm sorry we're a bit late, because we thought that Andy Burnham was going to come, really, because we found it much more fun here. Nick.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I hope that my cartoons can live up to it. I do see myself something as a cultural limbo dancer. However low you set your definition of culture, I can get under it. And I may be demonstrating that this evening. But yes, I come from the British Cartoon Archive. I run the British Cartoon Archive at the University of Kent. It's really the national collection of political and social comment cartoons from newspapers, British newspapers and magazines. We have 150,000 original drawings and 100,000 cuttings. But if you go to the website, the address of which is at the bottom of the screen there, you'll find 160,000 images online. And all the images that I'm going to show tonight, and I think all the images in the exhibition outside, are from the website. And so you can find them and use them. It's entirely freely available. And it is our 40th anniversary this year. I wanted to look at cartoons principally of the most recent economic crisis, but I went back as well to look at some, particularly of the David Low images from the 1930s. And this is Yogi Blimp. You may know his character Colonel Blimp, who is a kind of, well, I was going to say blimpish, but that's really developed from his character. He's usually in a Turkish bath, which is where he is at the moment in this cartoon. And that's David Low, who's looking in from the side. And Blimp is saying, "Gad, sir, the banks are right. The way to deal with slumps is to be confident there will be a restoration of confidence in confidence," or something. What? And this very Blimpish philosophy, I think, is an interesting one, because cartooning is not a didactic medium. The cartoonists are not there to teach people about the financial crisis, but they are to respond to the concerns that particularly the readers of newspapers have. And what the readers of newspapers feel, it seems, in these periods, a sense of loss, but it's not necessarily a loss of prosperity. It may be other things that they've lost, and one of those is particularly certainty, confidence, the ability to look forward with any sort of enjoyment and certainty. So I want to show you some cartoons. I said that cartoonists aren't didactic. They're not really hecklers either. They're not on the stage, but they're not simply in the audience shouting out. I think I asked Dave Brown, the cartoonist on The Independent, how he saw his role, and he said that he saw his job as to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, which is quite a nice idea. Martin Rowson, as well, cartoonist on The Guardian and other papers, he said that you don't attack anyone weaker than yourself. It is a medium for attacking the powerful, and particularly people who claim to speak for you. Cartoonists, I think, are closely involved and very interested in the political process. Someone like Steve Bell from The Guardian goes to political conferences and is a great admirer of politicians, strangely. In fact, he said that I have to admire politicians for their sheer dedication and commitment, and then I kick them up the arse. So that's the strange relationship that they have. But in the crisis, the financial crisis, I think I put this in the exhibition outside as well. These are the three great demons for the British media. There is the benefit scrounger saying the taxpayer owes me a living. The fat cat banker, this fat cat in a suit, the taxpayer owes me a living, and the politician drawn as a pig because he has his nose in the trough. And this symbolism is something which comes over very strongly. It's very useful for cartoonists. They don't really like having to label things like banker and MP, but when you need to represent abstract issues such as the recession or unemployment, you start having symbolic figures. And the fat cat, this is a Chris Riddell fat cat, speak your weight, you are morally bankrupt. It has all the elements there. The FSA is just a kind of mousetrap on its tail. Chris Riddell, before he became a political cartoonist, is a very successful children's illustrator, and he's very good at drawing these kinds of monsters and strange creatures. And this is a scarf cartoon as well, the idea. They're at it again, mis-selling insurance, and here is the fat cat flap. Why let that bloody cat back in? And here it is coming back through the flap. And this is Morton Morland in the Times as well. This is Cameron being tough on fat cats. He's threatening to rub their fur the wrong way. I don't know where the image of the fat cat originally comes from, but this idea of the fat cat being pampered and arrogant and useless, and yet kind of highly self-regarding and thinking of itself as terribly important. And here's Peter Brooks getting more and more surreal. This is 101 Uses for a Dead Fat Cat. This is Simon Bond's cartoon book, 101 Uses for a Dead Cat, which became a great success. And here you have the fat cat from the city with the money falling out of its pockets, which has been turned into a rather bizarre Christmas tree. But, and this idea of the dead fat cat, they wouldn't really miss these bankers if they went. There's a Steve Bell cartoon here about Mervyn King. I don't think he was terribly impressed with Mervyn King. There's further uses for a dead cat. So he's well, I was going to say completely comatose, but he's dead. But here he is in his different roles as Governor of the Bank of England, keeping inflation under control, stimulating the economy, warning of dark days ahead, talking down danger of a double-dip recession, predicting a return to sustained, well-balanced growth. And there he is, not lost but gone before, maintaining a steady course. So the idea of the symbol of recession, it comes up very much with, if you look at cartoons from the 30s in particular, of unemployment. Unemployment is a giant, it's a spectre, it's something that's haunting everyday life. It's a huge shadow in the background. And it seems that recession is not seen in quite the same way, but it is a monster. It's kind of a very threatening figure. It's something unusual and dangerous and on the edge of reality and on the edge of normal life. And here again is Chris Riddell with a monster labelled recession, which is round the corner from the couple who are watching, looking at the clearance sale. And just poking around the corner like Jack Frost is this little figure labelled Slowdown. I wanted to show recession as a spectre, and I rather like this Les Gibbard cartoon. I had to go back to '92 for this. This is canvassing, and in the background you have Neil Kinnock and you have John Major, and the couple who've just been talking to Kinnock, who's canvassing, say, the Conservatives, I think you'll find your people have been here already. So recession, debt, and unemployment. But the idea of recession as a spectre. Again, when you have these abstract ideas in cartooning, you often have to label them to make sure that people understand. And here again is recession as a kind of grim voodoo reaper in a cartoon that's in fact about George W. Bush. Bush is saying, "Hey, all the good old boys from Pappy's days, welcome back." And one of them is recession, who's burning dollars. The idea of the recession as a beast, as something kind of primal, uncontrollable, and let loose, turns up again in this Chris Riddell image, where he's talking to George Osborne. He's got his, as you see, he has his telescope the wrong way round. So it's carry on cutting, George. We'll be out of the woods long before this bad boy can catch us. So he sees him as considerably further away. Or again, quite often, there are a lot of images of the recession as a wave, as something which is going to engulf people. But again, that's a sort of uncontrollable force. And it's interesting that it's seen as almost a natural force. And then a Dave Brown cartoon of the economy as a corpse. This is Osborne saying, "The patient is healing, I can hear a heartbeat." This is because on the day that this was published, The Independent ran a story about the Olympics having given a bounce to the British economy, that it was kind of on its way to recovery. And here is Osborne saying that he can hear a heartbeat. Now, where did I leave my Olympic souvenir watch? Which is actually sewn inside the corpse. And that's the apparent heartbeat that he can hear. This whole idea of symbolism, symbolizing the various forces within the recession, is actually used by Martin Rowson in The Guardian, but it's also sent up. And so this is a wonderful cartoon sending up all the different images, the different symbolism. So we have the fat cat on the left, the fat cat. We have in the middle, George Osborne, who has on his arm the growth sloth. Then you have the sacrificial lamb, the lie boar, which is the boar which is saying it's a giraffe, which is the lie boy. And then you have the bank vole, which is the vole with a glass of champagne, and you have the blame gamekeeper who's saying it's all Labour's fault. And in the background, you have something that appears in quite a few of Martin Rowson's cartoons about the crisis. That is the monumental fur cup. So, I perhaps have to say that a little faster. The monumental fur cup. Which is there smiling in the background. Having used up quite a bit of my time, I think I'll just go on to some entirely gratuitous anti-banker jokes, because the banker, as a symbol of what is wrong, a symbol, a kind of demonization of the problem and of the people who caused it. This is a Tim Sanders cartoon, Damien Hirst, Lehman's banker. I think the idea is he's a shark, but he's also he's pickled and preserved. This is a Jonathan Pugh joke. Warning, bankers are known to operate in this area. And then there's a lovely Matt cartoon, which I think is rather nice, which is, I'm a banker, give my bill to one of the other tables. It's the whole idea of being too big to fail, and kind of so rich you don't even have to pay your own debts is one that the cartoonists take up and use again and again. This is Stan Murtry cartoon from the Mail, which is, as it says in the background, badger cull to start soon, and the badgers are saying to each other, humans are so stupid, the country would be a lot healthier if they had a cull of bankers. So the banker becomes this demon, and you don't really have to explain why you're being nasty to the bankers. They become more fodder for cartooning. To go back to this idea of the loss of confidence, I think that this is a very nice image to, I think this is almost the last image. This is Nicholas Garland cartoon. Nicholas Garland has lots of references in his political cartoons, lots of literary references, lots of artistic references. And here he's got an image taken from Bruegel's The Blind Leading the Blind. And here is the parable of the blind leading the blind. Only in his image, at the front is the politician leading the banker, who's leading the academic, who's leading the economist, who's leading the journalist, and right at the back is the public. And this feeling of having lost confidence, I think that this is a very strong sense in this particular cartoon and many others, that something almost indefinable, something very difficult to define, has gone, and it has made a very significant change. And this feeling that ordinary people can't do anything. Here is Griselda Grislingham from The Independent. This is recession monopoly. The rules are nobody does anything. And there's a kind of feeling of impotence and loss of control. And so we go back to this idea then that there is a significant change, but perhaps the change is not entirely in the cartoonist's view, worldview, to do with loss of prosperity, but is to do more with a loss of certainty, and that is at the bottom of the considerable changes that are taking place. So I think I probably run through my time. There's only one thing that I would say, is that alongside the British Cartoon Archive, I'm just setting up another archive. I was very busy on that this morning, which is the British Stand-Up Comedy Archive, which is a big archive of political stand-up comedy, which is very similar to a lot of the political cartooning that we have. And there's a lot of stand-up comedians are very keen to donate lots and lots of material. And this morning I spent the morning talking to Mark Thomas, who's the comedian and political activist, and he donated a great deal of material to us. And I think that in future this archive will also be of great interest and importance. And I brought along one of the things which he donated to us this morning, because I just couldn't resist bringing it along. He did a protest outside the Bank of England, and he does all sorts of kind of activist work. And this is the banner which he gave us, which he used outside the Bank of England.
The pound shop.
That seemed terribly appropriate to bring along. That's my excuse. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, while that's setting up, I shall tell you, shall I, who I am? Because you've introduced me already. I'm Pam Cox, I'm from the University of Essex. I'm a social historian and a sociologist, so neither a political scientist nor an economist, so we'll see what kind of conversation we can have, but I'm all for interdisciplinarity. I'm going to talk about a very particular element of everyday life and political debate connected to austerity times of recession, take you back to the 1920s, 30s, and talk about domestic service, which is a pretty fair bet hasn't been mentioned yet, I think, in the 2 days. So breaking new ground in the final session. My remarks are drawn from a recent BBC Two series that I made about domestic servants, which was called Servants, A Secret History, no, The True Story of Life Below Stairs. And I'll be showing a little clip from that in a moment. But I'll give you some background to it. I mean, domestic service was a massive part of everyday life in the 1920s, 30s, and indeed for many people today, if under different guises. It was among the biggest employing groups for workers. There were more workers employed as servants than there were in shipping industry, coal industry, and so on. 1 million plus workers at the turn of the century. And of course, professional classes, middle classes, all kept servants. So it's very much part of everyday life. Now, you might think in times of austerity that employing a servant would be one of the first things to go. People to cook for you, clean for you, wash for you, garden for you, drive for you, and so on. Not a bit of it. The demand for servants was absolutely high throughout the 1920s and 30s. You might assume, similarly, that as long as there was that huge demand for servants, that working class people, working class women would be only too happy to take those jobs in a time of high unemployment. Again, not a bit of it. Women abandoned, and young women in particular, abandoned service in their droves, and I'll come back to that in my final point. So it's this around the kind of the cultural politics of austerity and ambition. So who were the servant keepers in this period? It's not just the likes of the Granthams of Downton Abbey, or rather as downtrodden Abbey, as we rather portrayed it in the series. The majority of servant keepers were middle-class households, professional households, living in smaller properties, maybe employing 1 to 3 servants, but they certainly employed, one if they could, a single maid of all work if they could, or a daily or a charwoman or whatever. Now, many families, like the Granthams of Downton, downsized dramatically after the First World War, either because of increased land tax or death duties, or because the money had run out for various reasons, or because they converted their capital into other kinds of assets. But the collapse of the country house, which certainly happened after the First World War, does not mean the end of demand for domestic service. And just a quick note there on unemployment rates and the question of were they all in it together in the 30s, 20s and 30s, and of course they weren't, because unemployment in the 20s and 30s was always higher among working class groups and among social classes 5 to 7. So social classes 1 to 4, professionals, managers, supervisors, senior clerical workers and so on, accounted for 25% of the workforce and only 8% of the unemployed workforce. So their buying power remains firmly intact throughout this period. So it was very much a divided impact there. Now, how did servants respond to these changes that were going on? I just need to take you back a tiny bit to First World War. And of course, what happens in the First World War is that almost all remaining male servants, and there aren't that many men left in service by then, all those male servants enlist and go off to fight, and up to a third of women who were employed in domestic service go into munitions work. So the workforce very much transformed by that work. Now, after they'd had a taste of war work with its higher pay, better conditions, holidays and weekends off, for example, they, on the whole, didn't want to go back to mopping floors, peeling potatoes, emptying slop buckets, and all the rest of it. So those that could got out. And over 200,000 of them, this is of a workforce of around 1 million, left service, went into other jobs, into retail and clerical work, and so on. And that helped to fuel this servant shortage in that period. Now, those that returned to service, and many did, obviously, some became radicalised by the war and changes in labour relations, and they tried to unionise and improve servants' pay and conditions from within. And others, and this is the bit I want to talk to you about and the bit I want to show you the clip around, others tried to claim dole, unemployment benefit, almost for the first time, only just won this new kind of social protection. But this move in the early 1920s of women who ought to be in service claiming dole absolutely outraged the servant-keeping classes. and that's the clip I want to show you. So the argument was that women who could find work as servants should be denied unemployment benefit, denied that form of unemployment of social protection, even if they'd never worked as servants and had no experience of it whatsoever. So it's a very interesting cultural moment, I think, in the politics of austerity, because it's about entitlement to social protection and what is sacred and so on. So service is sacred to the servant-keeping classes. It's one of those things that, you know, they assume will always be there. And it's also, of course, a very highly gendered element of the debate, that women who can find work, skivvying in a sense, should take it and should be denied unemployment benefit. And I guess that's part of many, many other measures that were introduced in the early 1920s to reduce expenditure on unemployment benefits, the introduction of means testing and other tests for unemployment benefits around the time of the Geddes Acts, of course. Now, how did middle-class servant keepers respond to these new sets of circumstances? Some of them complain about these servants getting the dole, as we'll see in the clip. Others try to attract more servants or keep their servants by trying to meet them halfway, so by jazzing up their uniforms or getting them, you know, smarter caps and coloured aprons and allowing them to cut their hair, to bob their hair, for example. So you see a shift in employment relations in that point, and they spruce up their living conditions and so on. Others, if they just still, despite those measures, can't get anyone to work for them for the wages they're going to pay, look to employ other kinds of women. So for the first time, there's a demand for Irish maids, and up to that point, Irish maids have been used mostly in institutional settings like hospitals and that kind of thing, rather than private domestic homes. So Irish maids become much in demand. And also, women who'd spent time in institutions of various kinds, like the mad, bad, destitute workhouses and so on. Women coming through those kinds of routes became very highly desired workers. Now, others, the final group, opt to try and get rid of domestic service altogether, and they move to employing a daily or a char rather than a live-in maid, so they kind of cut the cost altogether. And they embrace this kind of servantless life in a servantless household, so you see a shift in the middle class. But really what that meant, the servantless household, was that in fact there was a housewife in there doing the work for love, not money. And so that was another big cultural shift of the time. So I'm going to show one clip to illustrate how that political debate about the dole and the politics of austerity, and then I'll end with 3 broad messages if I can. So this is a clip. I suppose it's a way of showing you how Parliament debated this, how people at the time, there's a woman called N. Swinton from Barnes, who I remember, and it starts with an interview with Matthew Paris in the House of Commons archives. So I think I just do play here.
Hands. The war's effect on the service economy was clear. There were now 200,000 fewer servants. When women refused service jobs and attempted to claim the dole, the outraged middle classes called on their politicians to fight their cause for them.
Isn't this place amazing?
That's incredible.
Some wallpaper. Let's look here at the Hansard.
It's even quite surprising to me that servants make it into parliamentary debate.
Well, they were very big in people's lives, and the lack of servants was very big in people's lives. And here we have Captain Terrell.
Who's Captain Terrell?
Captain Terrell is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Henley. And Henley was very much as Henley is today.
So what's Captain Terrell up to?
Captain Terrell is obviously bothered because his constituents can't get domestic servants, or can't get domestic servants for the wages that they're prepared to pay. He asked the Minister of Labour whether he will institute an inquiry into the abuse of the unemployment pay by women and girls who, accustomed to domestic service, now refuse to re-enter it. So, very cleverly, what Captain Terrell is doing, he's not saying my constituents can't get domestic servants, which is what he means. He's saying that women are abusing the dole by going onto the dole and taking money from the state rather than going out into gainful employment, in brackets, working for my constituents
So
as domestic
it's
servants.
blaming the dole for the servant shortage.
Exactly so. You have the breaking up of the simplicities of the class system, the ending of the days when there was a servant class, and women of a certain class would become servants, and women of another class would have servants, and the classes were supposed to know what they were there for, and not suppose that they could carry on working in munitions factories, for instance, as they had been
With
during
higher
the
pay.
First World War,
Yes.
with higher pay. So it's the breaking up of the certainties of people's social status and position. At this point, the Labour Party begin to get involved, and they begin to chime in on the other side of the argument. Mr. W. Thorne, a Labour MP, is doing what MPs and journalists love to do. He's bringing a real-life case to the House of Commons, a heart-wrenching case to the House of Commons. Miss Elmore, he says, is the eldest of 10 children, having 9 brothers and 1 sister, all living at home, 5 being under 14 years of age and still going to school, the youngest not being 2 years old. She was one of the chief supporters of the household when working at the rubber works. That's probably after or during the First World War. And in consequence, Miss Moore states that she was not used to domestic service, and as she was one of the chief supporters of the household, she could not see her way clear to accept the position of a domestic servant. And they're going to take the dole away from her, and her whole family rely on her. This is one of those lovely human stories that can be so much more effective in politics than dry argument.
Yes, and a girl like this who's 17, it says there,
Yes.
is expected to take a domestic service job, wherever
Yeah.
that may be,
That's
regardless
right.
of the fact that she hasn't been trained to do it,
Yes.
and regardless of what
and to suit the
what it's
convenience
paid.
of her mistress rather than the
Right.
looking after all her younger brothers and sisters.
With issues around servants and the dole so publicly raised in Parliament, certain newspapers waded in on behalf of the employers. The Daily Mail picks up the story. They run a campaign over 2 or more weeks called Scandals of the Dole, paying women to be idle, girls who ought to be in service. And they employ a special correspondent to investigate the problem. The most flagrant scandal connected with the dole is that of the thousands upon thousands of women who are drawing it when they ought to be in domestic service. This is a scandal which is capable of no kind of valid excuse. He calls upon the government to do one perfectly obvious thing: make it illegal for women to draw the dole when they are capable of domestic service. And so it goes on. Well, the campaign's gathering pace, and a week later there are lots of letters from correspondents. Here's one. To the editor of the Daily Mail. Sir, for 4 months I have been trying in vain to get a servant. I applied to the Labour Bureau. They told me they had no servants of any sort or kind. There were 10 women forming a queue in the office passage and up the stairs and in the street, obviously of the domestic servant class. I asked the clerk what they were doing, thinking they had come to try and get employment, but was told they were women waiting to receive the dole. It's N. Swinton from Barnes. All this public debate resulted in a committee of inquiry, staffed with women from all sides of the political spectrum, including Julia Varley, but no actual servants. The committee came up with some quite thoughtful recommendations: better training, better conditions, improving status. But in the end, its report was shelved. As with so many problems a government doesn't want to deal with, the inquirer's report was kicked into the long grass. For no one in...
I will pause it there. I will just finish with 3 points based on that, but hopefully that will give you some sense of what I was talking about the cultural politics of recession and where is the pinch really felt. So I think number one message: even in times of austerity, servant keepers were desperate to keep servants, as indeed they are now, middle of apparent austerity. There are more servants in central London now than there were in the 18th century, so I'm told. So, second point was that servant keepers fell into 2 camps, I think, in that time. Those that were prepared, perhaps on the more socially liberal side, to adapt to this new breed of working woman with her short hair and her demands for weekends off and things like that. So people who were prepared to accommodate these kinds of women. And those who, like N. Swinton from Barnes, who thought the servant class should jolly well remain in their place and wrote letters to the newspapers about it. there's a sort of fault line there in class relations that is fueled, I think, by the politics of austerity. And finally, and I think possibly most importantly, is that this is really about servants' search for respect. And even in a time of austerity, recession, high unemployment, young women rejected available jobs in service because they saw it as demeaning, as degrading, as unrewarding and unfulfilling, and that's the kind of evidence they give to that inquiry that was mentioned. And it's, I think, because they had a newfound ambition, even in the midst of politics of austerity, that they weren't prepared to take any job, that they had ambition. And if there's one message I'd end on, it's that the lesson is that the ambition of the young is the foundation for economic growth. So we'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Hi, hello. Well, I think I want to start by raising some slightly sceptical note, really, about how austerity and economic crises affect art, the arts, and how hard it is to interpret cultural history, really. Actually, I'll bring in an example from a book I've been reading, which is Seasons in the Sun by Dominic Sandbrook, which is a history of Britain in the 1970s. Not at a time, I don't know what the precise economic description would be. It wasn't a recession or a fiscal crisis, but it was certainly a very sort of turbulent time in the British economy, and things were going terribly wrong, and everyone was aware of a sense of crisis and stagflation. There you go. But it's clearly, you know, it's a troubled time, and that's the thesis of the book as well. That it was a time of extreme economic mayhem and political mayhem, and he weaves in all kinds of cultural stuff, which is fascinating. It's a fascinating book, by the way. I'm not attacking it. It's an amazing history book, actually, in the way the range of connections he makes between culture and politics, and including television shows. I mean, he talks about Fawlty Towers. He has this analysis of Fawlty Towers as a portrait of Britain in crisis and Britain in decline. I'm sure everyone remembers Fawlty Towers, or you know, watches it now even. It's still, well, I certainly still watch it on DVD. I mean, you know, with John Cleese, and it's a terrible hotel in Torquay. It's sort of this awful hotel, and it is supposed to have been based on a real hotel. That the Monty Python team once stayed at this hotel where his proprietor was just sort of maniac like Basil Fawlty, and he through one. I think he picked on Terry Gilliam, the American in particular. He couldn't stay. He claimed not to be able to understand his accent and things like that. And so, you know, it was sort of a portrait of a real place in Britain, and you know, and many people. Well, Sandbrook is like sort of sees it as a portrait of Britain at that time. Of this sort of this nation that seemed to reach the end of its tether, and everything was going wrong and nothing works. There's one episode which he writes about, which is actually it is one of the funniest episodes, where an American visitor comes to the hotel, and they arrive. The Americans arrive late at night. And ask for some supper, you know, and Basil Fawlty says it's impossible. The kitchen's closed. It's about 9 o'clock or something. And what? you closed the kitchen? And they, you know, right. So Basil Fawlty then has to try and make a meal. He doesn't know what a Waldorf salad is. He says we've run out of Waldorfs. And it's sort of, you know, this miserable, and you know, so obviously as Sandbrook sees it. You know, it's this miserable country where no one even knows what a Waldorf salad is, and also thinks it's rude to ask to be made. You know, Fawlty always sees the guests as putting on him. You know, he says it's typical. You come here, you expect to be waited on hand and foot. You know, people are staying at a hotel and are paying exactly to be waited on hand and foot, and so forth. So you know, it's very plausible. I think to see, of course, it's very plausible to see it as a portrait of Britain in crisis and economic and political and social, even moral collapse. But I remember watching it I was a child when it was first on, and we all watched it. I remember watching it absolutely collapsing on the floor with laughter, and also pain as well, extreme embarrassment for Basil Fawlty as this tragicomic character. played by John Cleese, as this, it's his great masterpiece, really. He just, it's a portrait of a man having an extended nervous breakdown, done through, and it also has the formality of farce. It's a farce, and so they have these farcical situations which gets worse and worse, and it all works because Fawlty never learns from experience and never responds in a sensible way to anything, so he'll get himself into a spiral of lies. So remembering watching it as a child, I wasn't aware of any social crisis or economic crisis happening in Britain. I mean, occasionally the lights would all go out because, and it was something to do with power cuts, but I just assumed that's what it was like, that was life. And I certainly, the internal comedy of Fawlty Towers was what drove it, really, rather than any social satire. In fact, Monty Python had always been, they started out as satirizing satire. There was the satire boom in Britain in the 1960s, and Monty Python came after that, and they were sort of rejecting the idea of satire. So I'm sure that there is a lot of portrait of Britain in the 70s in Fawlty Towers, but there's also a comic dynamic which is quite internal and is art. And I remember, sorry for childhood memories, but I also remember at O-level, just doing O-level history, and I'm a terrible history teacher, but he used to talk about, even at that level, we were told about the Depression, about how American cinema in the 1930s was all offered people these escape. It was all about musicals and The Wizard of Oz and fantasy, which offered people an escapist, escape from the Great Depression. And it's such a kind of mechanical, cliched, pat explanation, and so sort of trite that you could be told this at O-level by a teacher who would pick his toenails on the desk, as I remember. So, I mean, it wasn't a kind of, it wasn't nothing very subtle about that. And I just, ever since, I find it actually quite hard to believe those kinds of massive cultural readings of art, or cinema or anything. I mean, obviously, to take that analogy today, we might expect to see a lot of fantasy, a lot of musicals. Well, okay, so there's Matilda in the West End, fantastic musical. I mean, I've got a child, so we went to see it, and but it's extremely dark, I mean, I don't see how it's all about. It's almost like Tom Brown's School Days mixed with Kafka. It has a happy ending, but it's you wouldn't say that was escapist in any way. I couldn't possibly say, that's on now because there's a Great Depression, that's on because of austerity. Or War Horse, another huge musical. I mean, these are the most popular musicals. I mean, War Horse is about the First World War, and it's about, a horse that's dragged through the trenches and endures it tells the story of the First World War through the sufferings of a horse. That's, again, hardly escapist, and so that escapist theory doesn't work. Plus, there's plenty of fantasy in cinema, but if you look at recent years, I mean, the Lord of the Rings films began some years, and ended, I think, some years before the financial crash. So did the Harry Potter series, and the Harry Potter novels definitely come out kind of at the height of Blair's Britain, really, when things were good. Perhaps the interesting question there would be why people wanted to turn to fantasy literature when things were, in theory, so good. Maybe actually everyone was secretly miserable during the boom and wanted to turn to escapism. I don't know, but why adults wanted to read the Harry Potter novels, why everybody wanted to disappear off to Hogwarts in their imaginations. That actually happened when, if anything, perhaps it was rebellion against the kind of cool Britannia culture. Which sort of brings me on to art, I suppose, cool Britannia. I mean, art became a massive component of British culture. It's actually interesting to see. I reading this Sandbrook book about the 70s, and he draws. He doesn't just talk about television. He draws on everything, on John le Carré, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Ian McEwan's stories of the 1970s, punk. Brings in all that, the cultural thing. But there's not so much about art. Why not? Because art wasn't actually a big part of British cultural life in the 1970s or indeed the 1980s. It has become a big part of cultural life through the sort of art explosion that sort of my generation, I mean not me, but my generation led, people like Damien Hirst and Tracy Emin and all the famous ones, who all, some of them were taught by that guy over there, I believe, that artist, some of them all were. And I think, that they did have an interesting relationship to economic crisis, because Sarah Lucas, no, not Sarah Lucas, I think Sam Taylor Wood, one of these artists who's now a filmmaker, mainstream Hollywood kind of filmmaker, she said that they were Thatcher's children. And I think that they were in a double-edged way. When they started, when they held the exhibition Hearst curated an exhibition in 1988, all their sort of early kind of defining works in some ways were done in the early 1990s. And it was very much in the John Major era, after Black Monday. And I think there was a sense in which, and also, of course, I said they're exactly my generation, people who'd grown up very much, who'd sort of been at school when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, and then sort of grew up in this very radically changing society when old institutions were being destroyed. And so there's a sense of, and I think obviously what these artists expressed in some ways was, their reaction was, we've got to fend for ourselves and we're going to make money. Obviously, Damien Hirst, and which some of them succeeded at spectacularly. Damien Hirst is probably the richest artist in history, I suppose. So they had a Thatcherite ethos of making money. That was and that's one way in which they were responding to economic crisis, by being extremely hard and tough. But they also, I think, responded to it in the kinds of images they created. Damien Hirst's shark gliding through these chilly waters always looked to me, it looked to me, certainly when I first saw it in 1991 or 2, at the Saatchi Gallery. Saatchi had paid for this work to be made. He'd helped Hirst to hire a fisherman to catch the tiger shark. But it looked to me, like an image of this remorseless, cold, capitalistic individual swimming through the icy waters of international capitalism, I suppose. But it certainly had something chilly about it that seemed to express the condition of Britain at the time, as did Rachel Whitewood's house, which was a concrete cast of an East End terraced house that was being demolished, which was a sort of a ghost of saturated in a ghostly vision of history, really, of social history. Perhaps it was a house that had servants in it. Certainly, a house which had been full of ordinary British life through the 20th century and now had gone, and she created this kind of concrete ghost which represented it. And it certainly had a sort of bleak quality which did speak of a society that was bereft, and whether that was to do with the economic fears of that time or not, or just this more general sense of the huge change in values that had gone on in the Thatcher era. But I certainly felt that in the definitive works of these artists, the best works, if you like, there was that kind of sense of recession, and then they all made lots of money from it, and Britain became a consciously affluent place, and they were much part of that. Now, the thing is, it's hard to, this is where I come back to my skepticism, it's hard to see, certainly in the world of art, but the world of art is different, of course, from the actual world. That's why they call it an art world. It's a bit of a bubble, and it's the people, when after the financial crash, plenty of people perhaps even hoped, really, that there would be a sort of terrible crash of some of this kind of overblown contemporary art, and probably I did too, but it didn't happen. I mean, because well, as far as I can understand it, I mean, actually, if anyone could explain the economics of art, contemporary art, that would be a great sort of, service. But of course, the people who actually buy contemporary art are very well off. They probably are the fat cat bankers who go off with in all those cartoons. They certainly, they belong to the 1%, not the 99%. And at the same time, you know, so there is, the art economy is selling luxury goods to extremely wealthy people all over the world, many of them obviously American, German, Russian. You know, I think still probably more of an international market than a British market. And I think that has just gone on because, you know, the banks were bailed out and the rich, or maybe, you know, with the old Great Depression thing, the rich get richer and the poor get babies. Is that right? I mean, but, you know, I mean, that's happened. So in terms of art, the art market has pretty much continued. In fact, it's booming at the moment. It seems to have just gone on booming. And art hasn't, I mean, there is, however, a change. There certainly is a move towards the kinds of artists who are currently fashionable in that extremely well-heeled art world are more likely today to be political artists. Like Britain was represented at this year's, is represented at this year's Venice Biennale by Jeremy Deller, who is a very political artist, very left-wing, and who does work kind of social sculpture. But he was, I mean, you know, I used to sort of write about him and know him when he was, for years through the sort of the Blair era, through the boom era, he was very much, he was certainly well known, but he was actually on the edge of the art world, as it were, and, you know, he was not thriving in the way that he is now, and now suddenly he's the person who gets, you know, the establishment's behind because he's political, and, you know, and then there's a work actually there's a show in the Whitechapel Gallery at the moment which has a work by the Danish group Superflex, which tries to deal with, you go into a darkened room and there's a video projection of it's a hypnotist, and he tries to hypnotize you. The man on the screen tries to hypnotize you, and he says, "Now I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to imagine you're George Soros." And he makes you imagine. He tries to make you believe that you're George Soros, and then you wake and you're at the center of the world economy, and now you wake up and it is all over. And then I want you to imagine that you work hard and you have a nice house. The phone rings. You've been fired. So it tries to hypnotize you into experiencing the horror, the sort of the essence of the financial crisis. So artists are, I mean, artists are trying to make works about reality, and there's a shift in art towards a political consciousness. Whether that stuff is really an acute response to what's happening now, I'm not sure. Whether it should be. Do artists even have a responsibility to be direct reporters on life? I think it's a big mystery. I think it's in the end, in history, it's for history to decide, first of all, what art is worth remembering, and secondly, what it might have all meant. The great contrast with the 1930s in art is politics, because it's not just that the 1930s was a Great Depression, but also in the 1930s, people in the West seriously questioned capitalism, well, which some people do now, indeed. There was obviously a powerful socialist movement, communist movement, you know, you have events like the Spanish Civil War. So someone like George Orwell, you know, was part of this great international left that existed at the time, and also part of, you know, and Orwell was a critical part of a generation which, you know, where people in Britain would have seen Stalin's Russia as a positive model because they seemed to, you know, where it was, oh, they're doing it better there. And now, I think the reality now is that there are artists who are seriously political, such as Jeremy Deller, but of course there isn't, either in art or in life, outside art. There are things like Occupy, but there's more of those things more about protest. There isn't, you know, there isn't a communism, basically, that's dead. And I think that affects the arts hugely. The arts are not so much shaped by events as by ideas. And so in the 1930s, there were artists who were swept up by ideas. Picasso, who eventually joined the Communist Party. The American artists, people like Pollock, who were all supported by helped by the New Deal, and again who were involved with socialism and communism, and their art had that kind of that seriously engaged quality. And so, in the end, today, art is an entertainment for the rich, which makes it difficult for it to be socially critical. And I'm talking about gallery art, obviously, contemporary art. The contemporary art, it is basically an entertainment for the super rich, and also an entertainment for the middle class who like to go to places like Tate Modern. It doesn't have the critical edge that art perhaps still could have in the 1930s. And even when it is critical, it's basically critical within what is an extraordinarily commercial world, all of which makes it sort of tends to falsify what critical edge it has. Perhaps that's an unduly pessimistic view. But as I was trying to say about Fawlty Towers, it's very difficult to interpret the arts, and perhaps there are things today which we don't even recognize as being profoundly about austerity, but will look that way in 20 years' time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's lovely. Thank you. Sorry, man. That was a bit of magic, man. No, in about 8 minutes' time. Okay, thank you. Good evening. My name is Frank Gray, and I have the pleasure, the genuine pleasure, not even being here, but also running a regional film archive. Regional film archives are quite a distinctive phenomenon in this country. They start in the mid-1970s, and there are 8 of them across England, and then there's also a wider selection of national film archives. But collectively, we collect anything and everything to do with screen heritage, screen culture, and that is, of course, is film, but it's also video, born digital material. For us, we also collect the Magic Lantern because we're particularly interested in all aspects historically of screen culture, and if you collect the Magic Lantern, effectively you can start in the mid-17th century. I guess there are a number of things which I'd like to say this evening. One is to think about the, if you like, film, both in its amateur and professional sense, how this medium engages with periods of economic instability. And of course, when I think about it, because of my background as a film historian, but also too, if you like, a narratologist, I'm very interested in the way in which popular narratives are shaped, both for commercial reasons, but also, if you like, personal reasons. And it's interesting for me to think about moments of economic uncertainty as a particular kind of narrative, and how that then can reflect our own lives, but also too gets then reflected through particular kinds of, if you like, of commercial narratives. So a narrative which is what is the narrative of fiscal squeeze? Well, is it one of depression? It's one of dislocation, disorientation, strangeness, instability. It's a narrative where is there an absence of comfort, stability, security, certainty? Nick used the word certainty. It's also essentially one of health and well-being. So the narrative of fiscal uncertainty is one which you could say it's about a loss of trust, a loss of faith, loss of confidence, loss of hope. And of course, I will always connect Freud's notion of the uncanny to this, translated as unheimlich, that the moment you enter into this kind of unhomeliness, because your familiar touchstones to do with health and well-being, the idea that your salary will continue, your job is secure, your salary will increase, you'll be able to prosper. What happens when you start going in the negative direction? So there's something about, if you like, the fiscal squeeze narrative, which is a very complicated one, because especially, for example, the one we're in now, it hasn't ended. We're in it. Maybe we're in Act 1, because the crisis has just started. And the idea we're not working towards, that sense of that classical narrative and its three-act structure. We're at the start of something. The Chancellor might say that there's the recovery is starting, but is it? So the sense of actually moving through that narrative arc, we're in the middle, not the middle, we're at the start of something, and we don't quite know how it's going to be resolved. When is the fiscal narrative going to end? How is it going to develop? So if you look at filmmakers and the way they dealt with fiscal insecurity, instability, and you think about, in terms of the history of film, obviously the 30s is a very, very important time. And you can think about these particular moments. So you can follow the course of the economy and think about the relationship to film production, both amateur and professional. I say amateur and professional because through my own historical work and also the work of our archive, that we're very engaged all the time with films made by individuals, families, corporations, and also too by industry. So you have that sense of kind of high and low, very, very different kinds of responses. For the purposes tonight, and I'm sure that this could be cut in different ways, I've been thinking about 4 different ways in which, if you like, film culture, screen culture, has responded to moments of economic uncertainty. First of all, you could say the literal response or the direct response. And you can look at film, especially from the 1930s. The 1930s is a very, very important period within film culture, not just in this country, but also across Europe and North America, because it's when individuals have cameras for the very, very first time. It's no longer an industrial phenomenon. It's literally, in this country, you can go to a chemist and you can buy yourself a camera, and then you shoot something, you film something. So something about the way, this first category, if you like, thinking about literal, direct responses. It can be instantaneous, literally filming something about with the way we live now. So there's a sense of immediacy. It's not surprising in the 1930s you have the rise of activists in this country, whether it's trade unionists, members of the Communist Party, who start to make films for the very first time, but they're making films of demonstrations. They're making films about the nature of the society now, and they're doing it for a purpose because they want society to change. You can look at that history of activism, that history of engaging directly with fiscal uncertainty. You can trace that from the 1930s right through to being a film being made right now to do with kind of economic and social unrest. Look at YouTube. You can see films being made today which engage with that. That's number 1. Number 2, I called delayed responses, which is very interesting, the way in which, if you look at the history of the economy, you'd like to think, especially when you look at the feature film industry, that it kind of responds instantly. No, it doesn't. But it's interesting looking at the kind of the delayed responses. Because of some work I did a few years ago, I was quite interested when you look at, for example, like the way in which the British economy and culture in the 1980s, especially think around the kind of miners' strike. When do feature films respond to this? Yes, they do. But, for example, you put films like Brastoff, 1990. That's 5 years after Orgreave. Billy Elliot is 1996. Full Monty is 97. It's not an instant response. It's a delayed response, which is very interesting, the way in which Jonathan's saying, too, painting, sculpture doesn't instantly know. So it's very interesting the way in which the nature of these delayed responses. And of course, that builds upon a sense of memory, a sense of lived experiences. Coming today, of course, as you can see in any tube station in London, there are posters for Billy Elliot. You know, Billy Elliot is still with us, so it's very interesting the way that contains, reflects its connectedness to the kind of mid-1980s. So, if you like, direct, immediate responses, delayed responses. Third category I'd posit would be like the indirect or the lateral response. Now, this is not about literally representing now, thinking about political cartoons, but that indirect or lateral response, kind of the way it connects, if you like, with the zeitgeist of a particular period. A structure of feeling, as Raymond Williams would say, of a particular climate. So you could look, for example, at that social realist tradition in this country through feature films. I'm thinking of the work of Ken Loach and Shane Meadows. And of course, you could say that, well, what their films often deal with is not only working class lives, but also to, if you like, perpetual economic crisis. Not the immediate one, but the fact that there's those who live in precarious economic circumstances all the time, not just in the particular moment, for example, of this fiscal squeeze. There's also, in terms of indirect lateral responses, something which you could think about in terms of the, if you like, the metaphorical engagement with crises, anxieties. Jonathan mentioned kind of thinking about Harry Potter. Well, you know, if you look at Harry Potter, Star Wars, zombie movies, genres like war, science fiction, horror, you're continually being attacked. And so there actually is a very strong strand of commercial filmmaking, which is about perpetual anxieties. However, now maybe, I guess this happened in Harry Potter at the very end of it, but if you look at the zombie movies, war and science fiction, etc., they take you through the classic 3 acts, and they present the crisis, and then it gets resolved. The sun comes out at the end. Health is restored. Society blossoms again. It's gone through the pain. And of course, what's interesting is, in terms of an audience, how that makes us feel. Because there might be real perceived crisis all around us, but we're actually going and watching a crisis on film, a fictional crisis. But what's different between what's on screen and what's in real life is that on the screen crisis is resolved. It comes to an end. Does that make us feel well? The indirect lateral response. And then finally, which this is probably my favorite, but that's because I think in quite diverse ways, is literally no response at all. The idea of those films, those genres, you could refer to as structured absence, because that's that filmmaking which is oblivious to such changes. Because literally, these are narratives which are very much about comfort, pleasure. That this can be romance. I think you think of romance, comedy. This is, the feel-good movie. But this is material which, if you like, takes us out of ourselves. That's very much about the four are very much, if you like, narratives which are created very much through a kind of industrial process. Of course, we have to think about ourselves as audiences, as viewers, as readers of this range of material. And of course, we live in a world which is different from what we see on screen. And of course, we're affected in a different way by economic problems. And of course, they change our perception of the world. So it's interesting, isn't it, to think about how we engage with all this screen culture. And at moments of fiscal uncertainty, do we engage differently? How does it make us, therefore, how we identify, empathize? How do we relate to these screen works? And of course, even the, if you like, the kind of the contrast, I think of those films which have on screen, there's no response. But actually, we enjoy that. We enjoy actually engaging with material which actually takes us away from kind of everyday concerns. and therefore, if you like, the heightened pleasure of, if you like, generic and stereotypical narratives that work towards resolution, comfort, and well-being. And also to these narratives, because they work towards kind of this pleasing resolutions, they appeal to our sense of hope and optimism. So, like, we don't know when this present economic crisis is going to end, but we're experiencing we can choose to experience narratives which are continually offering us pleasurable endings, conclude with, as I said in a cheesy way, the sun coming out. And I guess, too, also connected to that, if you like, is the power of metaphor. Films which present struggles and difficulties, and the collective power within this fictional world to overcome such difficulties. Now, thinking about those different responses, I've brought you two short film extracts. They're 2 minutes each. They connect in very different ways. They connect. Their connectedness to what I've been talking about, I think, is interesting to consider. The first is a film which was produced by the Sussex Communist Party in 1938. These, I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the 30s is a phenomenal time because of the way in which visual media changes, because moving images is something which is not just part of the cinema. It can actually be brought into your home. It can be taken to your workplace. It can be taken to a meeting. So there's something quite transformative about the way in which film starts to be used in the 1930s. If I start this one, I'm a Mac person, yeah. I'm a little nervous. Oh, there we go. Oh. This is not a staged event. This is a member of the Sussex Communist Party in Brighton on a particular day in which a demonstration had been organised in front of the Employment Exchange. For a period of about 2 years, the party recorded many of its activities, its marches, its meetings. And then, of course, they would make the films and show them. So this is very far from a raw film. It's a very composed film because it's footage from the day which they shot, but then, of course, it's been edited and titled. So it's more than just a recording event. It's actually, if you like, creating party news. And of course, like so much of the history of silent film, usually there would be a speaker, a lecturer, a describer, who would provide background and context. But it has something news, it has something of the quality of news in terms of an immediacy. This is a story which has recently happened. Now, how to contrast? This is a film made 3 years before. I must say that the film made by the Communist Party, in relative terms, such films are quite rare. Not every branch of the Communist Party in this country in the 1930s is making films. It's very interesting when you start looking across the films, just how much films of marches and political activity did take place. But when you look at archive collections across this country, what you find the majority of the films are about everyday life and the, if you like, the pleasures of the family. It's not appropriate for today, but of course, anyone connected to a heritage collection and archive, you become very aware of how objects change through the process of being archived. When you see something, for example, as this, which is very much made for in domestic circumstances, it's made for a home, for a family, for their use. And then over 70 years later, you see it at the British Academy. Strange things happen. This is a film, of course, which represents, if you like, well-being, comfort, the pleasures of family. There's something, this is happening today on a beach, probably not in England, but in somewhere, some pleasant beach somewhere. And it's what individuals do with cameras, especially when with young families. And of course, it's the pleasure of capturing the moment and then sharing it. Films are being uploaded to YouTube right now, which will do this very thing, of course, in color and sound. This engagement with the everyday through people, you could refer to this as a home movie, but of course this is quite a sophisticated home movie because it's edited, it's just not raw footage. But the way it captures a sense of childhood, it's also too, if you like, kind of, this is in the just using it and thinking of it dialectically in relationship to the previous film. Of course, it's a different worldscape, it's a different scape, it's a landscape, and the kind of the gentle waves, the kind of the pleasure of this place, and how it's been shot to convey the kind of the pleasure of this family moment, but in a very particular way. There is this real coherency of material from the 30s right through, and it continues now into born digital material. And I would argue that it's just not family movies. It's actually about what they convey in terms of, it's a different kind of zeitgeist. And it's almost in terms of, if we're interested in kind of health and well-being, it's how that is reflected through, in this case, the moving image. And if you like, it provides, if you like, perhaps a certain touchstone, a certain foundation. So crudely, it's how you would move in the 1930s. You could move from that to, I don't know. You might think kinship with Fred and Ginger Rogers, and or you'd think of Jimmy Cagney. And today, if you think in terms of all that family material you can find on YouTube, how you move from that to, WWZ, World War Zombie. And I'll just conclude by saying what's I find engaging but also very taxing is when you take something like film and think about all these different approaches to the medium, and you become aware of just not just different subjects, that's the obvious thing, but also too, if you like, different states of mind. And so there's something about kind of the family and domestic material. It's almost like, does it represent a certain sense of well-being, a certain sense of homeliness, which is very important to us. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank them for really very, very rich fare. I just have a couple of rounds very quickly of questions. Could you, when you, because it's being filmed, could you stand up and identify yourselves? But I'd like to take a couple of questions in a go. So there's one gentleman, two, any other questions? Three. So 1, 2, 3. So we take the questions first. Thank you very much.
Jeremy Thomas. First of all, to Pamela, you mentioned the servant-keeping classes and the persistence of servant-keeping through the period, which you described, if I don't get it wrong, as more or less constant. How far did the abandonment of the gold standard, with the consequent effect on middle-class incomes, seeing as some of their income would have been derived from British shares, whose value of whose dividends would have been affected by leaving the gold standard, how far did the abandonment of the gold standard have an effect? Secondly, if any, to Jonathan and Frank, there's been the parallel drawn in both of your talks, if I don't mistake you, between the atmosphere, the spirit of British culture today and that which prevailed in the 1930s. Might possibly a better parallel be between today and the 1920s, when there was a darker strain in culture, as exemplified by, for example, Siegfried Sassoon's Memories of an Infantry Officer, or T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men?
David Heald, University of Aberdeen. It's a question directly to Nicholas. The cartoons you showed all had a rather oppositionalist position about the bad consequences of fiscal squeeze. It's the fat cat bankers, for example. Is there to what extent is there another strand whereby it's all the fault of the people on welfare, the shirkers, the unemployed? So is it always oppositionalist to what governments do? And are there cartoons that would reflect is how generous the employers are, for example?
Great.
Thank you. I am simply a member of public, and I am no artist, but certainly interested in art, and I feel that art is important. Yes, art entertains, certainly. Art also reflects our times. But I would like a little bit more on the art contribution to the social movements. Rather, how does how the artist effort compares with the efforts of other players in this field, like academics, for instance? Yes, how do yes. Can you compare? I would try and compare the efforts of an artist in building social movements and effort of an academic.
Thank you very much.
Somewhat clear?
I think it's Pam, him, and then you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. It's an interesting question. And certainly the abandonment of the gold standard does have a major impact on middle-class incomes. That does have an effect on, obviously, people's ability to afford servants. But I would say it's difficult to separate that from those other variables that are in play at the time, which are the rise of the suburb, the beginnings of the movie, the growth of suburbs, the growth of what's seen as a modern kind of marriage, modern kind of household, which is free from the prying eyes of servants. So even people who can afford it no longer want to afford it because they're looking for a new kind of intimacy, rather like in the films that you were portraying there. So I think I'm waffling because I'm thinking, yes, good question. I would like to look at that in more detail, but I think it's certainly the case. Yes, there is an impact on living standards, but it's got to be balanced with that cultural pull away, cultural move to privacy that you see. Indeed.
Well, very interesting to think about the relationship between 20s and 30s. One of the reasons why I drew attention to the 30s and showed those extracts from the 30s is because that very much reflects the nature of that kind of filmmaking in the country, because the small gauges which enabled amateurs, individuals, families to make films for the first time, it starts slowly from around 1925, and it only really becomes, if you like, somebody referred to the democratization of film, but that's something which starts around kind of 29, 30, and it grows across that decade. So the 20s, well, it hasn't quite happened. That there is real, if you like, there's quite real stability, if you like, in terms of film and its engagement with the culture, and who makes films from the mid-1890s right up to the kind of end of the 20s, and then there's this real shift.
Okay, 20s better?
I think it's really, I wanted to thank you, because I wanted to say this. I was just thinking during the session, I mean, the 30s have become, I think the reason I said the 30s is because whereas Andy Warhol might so very nearly have said the 1930s are so famous. I mean, there's a sense in which the whole history of the 20th century, that this experience of the 1930s is so mythic. It's such a mythic image for us of depression, economic depression, and also of cultural responses to it. I suppose that's what I was trying to say really was that it's a kind of it's a cliche that I absorbed long before I studied history at university, and it came into play as soon as there was, this financial crash. People started talking about the 1930s, and it probably is a very bad analogy. I think it's a trope, it's a cliche that we always think about the 1930s in these sort of as a comparison. So it's, I mean, what the cultural reality of the 1930s would be a fascinating thing, I would have thought, for someone to write a history book about. I mean, how true is any of that? These things about cultural responses to the Depression. Is it just a sort of odd myth that was created later on?
1920s were in shock still, would it be?
Sorry, I had one. Sorry. In terms of analogy, but in terms of the art of austerity, actually, maybe another analogy is when you look at Lucian Freud's early paintings in the 1950s, like the man standing in his flat in Paddington with it, or his studio in Paddington with a kind of shabby coat on and everything. I mean, Freud certainly created an image of austerity, actually, literally of austerity. But of course, it's odd we're now using the austerity. I don't know, was it Cameron who coined austerity for describing this current situation? Osborne. And the actual word, which obviously is a word that it doesn't come from the 1930s. It comes from clearly the post-war situation. And it certainly is easy to see, the condition of post-war Britain when you look at Lucian Freud's early work.
Snark piquant, I seem to remember, was a feature of the age of austerity. Is cartooning always oppositional?
Yes, and I think the point also was about the image of the welfare scrounger.
Yes, you had one. You definitely had one, which is a
Absolutely.
Daily Mail one.
we had I think the Scott Clissold one, which was the three demons, one of whom was the welfare scrounger. It's very interesting that the other two, the banker and the politician, do occur frequently in political cartoons, but the welfare scrounger is a figure more from the news stories and from the editorials of the newspapers. And I think it's an interesting question why that should be. I think it's partly to do with the fact that the British tradition of political cartooning is about attacks on those in power and subverting the political narrative. That it's to do with ironic distance from kind of politics and political explanations. And I think I quoted Martin Rowson's statement that you don't, as a political cartoonist, tend to attack those who are less powerful than you are, but those who are more powerful. And I think that's probably what's happening with the political cartoonist view of those three evil figures, that two of them represent themselves as speaking for everyone or acting for everyone. And this is a particular type of arrogance which does concern and annoy British political cartoonists, while the other one is acting for themselves. And whereas that can be seen as morally bad, it's not something which is usually the focus of political cartooning. So I would say that British political cartoonists don't tend to campaign so much as to criticize and to have this ironic distance, so that they're not campaigning in the same way that a newspaper editorial, which attacks welfare scroungers, might be campaigning. They're tending to stand aside from that narrative and subvert it and criticize it.
We have a question, last question on art. I'll come back on art movements and political engagement. Anybody want to learn quickly? Because
So yeah, what was that question again?
The relationship of art to social movements.
Yeah. Okay. I think. Well, again, I think in the 1930s, to go back to and in the 1920s, actually, in the first half of the 20th century, let's say, artists were involved deeply with social movements, specifically revolutionary movements. Obviously, some of the most, some of the art which most directly responds to financial collapse, social collapse, political collapse is the Dadaist art of Germany just after the First World War. I mean, the German Dadaists like Hannah Höch and George Grosz, they were activists. I mean, most of them were communists to some degree, and some of them were involved with the Spartacist rising and things, and then they were campaigning against they made that there's their works like there's a piece by Hannah Höch which is a collage called "Cut with the Kitchen Knife Through the Last Bloated Beer Belly of Weimar Germany," which is absolutely of a society disintegrating. It's shards of little bits cut out from newspapers, which amount to and Dada was a movement. Yes, Dadaism was a movement which could be anarchistic. I suppose Duchamp was more of an anarchist Dadaist, but a lot of the Dadaists in Germany were, in Berlin certainly, they were socialists and communists. The art movement, funnily enough, the abstract expressionist art movement, which in America, which kind of brought American art, modern art, into the world's eye really after the Second World War, and which is often seen as having been a sort of stooge of the CIA, that in a sort of part of the Cold War. But in reality, many of those artists, as a movement, if anything, it was left wing, and it came out of the 30s, and artists who'd been on the public programs of the Roosevelt era, and who were influenced by the Mexican Marxist, communist, revolutionary mural painters. And so they very much were a movement that had a sense of wanting to engage society, which resulted in completely abstract art, so go figure. But anyway, so you're...
If there's any more questions, you can perhaps put them to our panel over a glass of wine. I'm sorry I've run over. I've been a very inadequate chair, but it seemed to me that they were very wonderful papers. I'd very much like to thank a really rich set.